Hi everyone, I'm Julian, and I'm co-founder of Fractal. We do identity and payment solutions for onboarding folks to Web 3.0 protocols. So I want to talk about not how to design protocols, but how to enable adoption of these protocols. And for that, I want to start with the first definition, what I perceive as what this thing is, a protocol, and how can we take a look at that. Maybe first heads up, even though I'm quite interested in the tech behind it, I am an economist myself, so I want to take a look at that more from an onboarding and strategic perspective. It does, however, have an influence on how you design that, and this is the reason why I want to talk about it, to make sure that when we go into designing a protocol, that we have that in mind. So what is it? I'm defining it as an open source, or it's actually not me, but when I'm talking about it, I mean then an open source, permissionless, zero margin protocol. And the good thing about it is that it eventually becomes a public utility. But when you take a look at that from an academic perspective, I'm always trying to find something in the past that has been researched. And one thing that I found was an adoption of standardization research body that was actually quite good, and it was quite old. And it had a lot to show or to say about how to go into that. And this was something from 2004 that I found quite helpful, actually one of the more the newer studies. This is about standards and why it is a winner-takes-it-all market, and why it eventually will be a battle, a face-off of various different standards if there are more than one. Okay, so what are we going to talk about, or what am I first going to talk about, and then hopefully all of us together, is how do they work? And maybe you have a different opinion on how they work. What do scholars say? How do you win this war? And what are strategies to winning it? Oh, it's not design advice. Sorry about that. Okay, so let's jump right in. The Web 2.0 was pretty much about the application layer. So this is where the value was actually captured. And the protocol layer was hugely influential, but not very able to capture the value that it created. And the question is, how is it going to change? Is it going to be an application layer that's going to shrink, and a protocol layer that's going to extend? Or is the application layer going to stay the same and the protocol layer just going to grow? So maybe you've seen this, graphic in one way or another. I rebuild it just to change it later, but you'll find the original post in the link, and we'll share the slides later, I guess. So what it says is, okay, we have cloud storage, and this is the Web 2.0, and now we are going to Web 3.0, and that's the matter of it. So we'll just change from one state to another, and instead of Dropbox, we have Storj, or we have, actually, and this is where I find it a little bit confusing, because it mixes together dApps and protocols at the same time. So you remember, this was thesis 1. This is thesis 2. So maybe the application layer stays the same, but the protocol layer just grows. And this is how an environment could look like if the second thesis is true, which is that we will just have the same usual players on the market, so the Web 2.0 players, but we will also have an addition to that on the market as well. So just to, in this case, the technical infrastructure will be used, but it could also be used by the traditional players. So this is a thesis that it's not going to be a clean-cut market between Web 2.0 or Web 3.0, but it's going to be a mix of all of these. So for example, you have the interfaces and the brands that are already there. What prevents them from just plugging in to the Web 3.0 protocols and get part of their, for example, in this case, cloud storage from these providers as well. It would just be augmented with their proprietary base and thus, for example, work better for certain use cases or for high demand or whatever. It would, however, level the playing field, you know, so if we go back, maybe we see some other interfaces popping up. So how protocol wars won then? Like, how's it going to be decided which protocols we are going to use? It's going to be the technically most advanced protocol, right? I mean, well, if I say it this way, then probably not. And we've seen that, and I don't want to bore you with like past protocol wars and how they turned out. I mean, I find that pretty interesting, but I can see why that might get boring. But I did the reading to try to come up with why not the technical most advanced protocol will actually be the winner. And this is pretty well researched. It's not about blockchain protocols. I mean, some papers are already out on blockchain protocols on that topic, but who cares, right? I mean, the approaches and the strategies and the reasons are actually the same, because from my perspective, how I perceive that from an economical point of view is that you're trying to win a generalization war here. So there are equilibria, that's the plural of equilibrium, but you guys know what I mean. So there are states where or reasons why a technically advanced protocol isn't going to make the race. And it can already stop that in the tracks if there is no other protocol involved even. So for example, it just doesn't gain the momentum to go from the equilibrium of 0, so no users, to the equilibrium of 100%. So for example, I'm being the only one with the telephone, right? Like, there's not too much sense in me having a telephone. I can't call anyone. So it's kind of hard to pick up a use base to make that work. But once I have a certain use base, it's a lot of fun, and then everyone will join in. So it needs to get over this first step. There might not be much sense in having a protocol or generalization in the first place. And then there's also the fence setting, like established players or users not wanting to commit to one standard and just say, well, can wait, you know, like, why should I just commit right now? I can just see who makes the race. There is a lot of path dependency. So it's like my dad not wanting to switch from a Windows to a Mac because he knows how Windows works, even though it doesn't work great. It's better than learning a new standard. Or a strong developer base, and this just goes into the same thing, like all the games are on PlayStation, why, you know, like there's no sense buying another console, even though that would be better. It's even a lot harder if there are proprietary standards, because then you also get the vested interest of the people that actually build for this standard. They don't want you to adopt to this new standard, even though it's 10 times better, because they don't get royalties anymore, you know. So they don't want to switch. And for that not to happen, they just subsidize the usage of their own protocol. So it becomes a lot cheaper, and there's very little you can do about it. I mean, you can also subsidize it, but that will just offset their subsidization. And since you're the newcomer to the market, it's pretty hard for you to gain the same attractiveness. Or good old patents. All right. So why am I telling you about that at all? I believe that it's very important to understand how you can gain adoption before you build your protocol, before you do the token engineering even. And there are a couple of questions that you might want to ask yourself. For example, how many players you need to involve to make it work. So is it a multi-sided, or like how many sides how many players does your protocol need to actually function? Is it demand or supply side? Is it more important to get men to your dating platform or women? And that's pretty easy to solve. But then there are different protocols where the unique insight is on choosing the right side, and then obviously also optimizing for it. And that's something that should inform also your token engineering, right? All right, so do you cater businesses? Do you cater consumers? Oh, and that's important. Is it a first mover advantage or a second mover advantage? We'll get to that later. And is that something where the standard is already in the market? Thus, are there high switching costs because people have already gotten accustomed to something? If that's the case, then is there an underserved subset that you can cater to? What kind of connections, interoperabilities can you get to make the thing more attractive? All right. So who of you guys know this graphic here? All right. That is more from the Web 2.0 software as a service thing. That's Christoph Jans on how to build a $100 million business, I think. And I am using his framework and adapt that to the adoption for protocol methodology. So what he's saying is like, hey, look, you just need to win one customer who gives you 100,000 euro in annual recurring revenue, and then you're good to go. And and he calls these customers elephants. And if you're hunting for flies, then you need 10,000. And so that's pretty much the same thing for adoption. Like, what kind of accounts do you need to get to actually get adoption? Are those elephants? So corporates? You get, for example, MasterCard to put their data onto your protocol, and then you're good to go. Or are you hunting flies? So you need a lot of small dApps using your protocol for it to actually gain momentum. And based on that insight, you might want to change your strategy a little bit. So what I did is put the size of the adoption deals or like target customers on the left side, and took a look at is there a standard or is there no standard? So for me, that's equal to are there low switching costs or high switching costs? And took a look at what we believe the right strategies would be. So just imagine you would have low switching costs. So it's if you're taking a look at the left side of it, so the elephant side, we're talking about an uncaptured market, and you're going for corporates. And in this case, what we feel is that you want to go for getting, it's pretty much a land grab. You want to get the adoption early to create those logins for your protocol. And you do want to make it easy to integrate. And that means taking a look at what the legacy software is and how to integrate to enable corporates to actually use the protocol. That is different when you go to the established standards, so you have high switching cost. And in that field, it's really hard to get into the market, to actually get adoption. And you can't just go full force because they will probably outspend you, especially when it's a proprietary standard. So you want to find your niche with which you can actually grow. So you want to see, are there customer fields that haven't been really surfaced? For example, taking a look again at the usual go-to-market strategy world, you have all those digital banks serving customers that usually have a hard time finding a bank account, like foreigners coming to Berlin, right, number 26, or young customers that are just at the point of choosing because, like, again, my poor dad has to, be the example of choice. He would just not change to number 26. That's just not something that he would do. So you find your niche. And actually, quite a few companies have grown that way and have seen adoption. On the lower side, it is a very different focus because you don't have those custom integration into legacy software, where you have like large customers that you want to cater to, but you have a bunch of small app developers or dApp developers that you want to attract. So this is more it's kind of like sales versus marketing. So it's not UX because you're not directly communicating with the users, but you're directly communicating with the developers. So you're more focused on having a great developer experience, showcasing how your protocol works, how to integrate that. And again, the difference is on the left side, it's more a question of how quick can you go to market, because you want to get those users, you want to lock them in. And on the right side, there's already an existing standard, so you want to find your niche and grow with that. All right, so there are some ideas that I have, and I'm quite interested to hear your thoughts about that, because obviously we are not the ones developing the protocol, we are the ones developing the applications. And what I am seeing is that there is a lack of embracing the importance of the application level. So thinking about like, okay, how do I really get adoption? And that all the way through to thinking about the full process. So closing the circle and taking a look like, hey, that actually something that makes sense. And it is important to think about both. And I would say on an equal, pretty much equally. So when you think about how to design your token and your token economy, then also think about, okay, how's that going to affect my user adoption? So second thing is, no one really cares if it says blockchain in your product. And the best products actually are run without saying that it has anything to do with blockchain. And this is something that we discovered ourselves because we software called Fractal Blockchain, and then we saw that actually that was just confusing for people because they were like, wait, you provide an onboarding service, so what does it have to do with blockchain? I don't see blockchain anywhere here. And we believe that this is actually where you want to get. Like, we're not talking about, it's not an internet delivery service, it's just a food delivery service, right? So when you're at this point, then it becomes native for folks to use it. And the things that are there are not really working. Like, this is something that was the most surprising to me. Like, it's not this weird anti-blockchain lobby that's there trying to prevent this thing from popping up, but if you compare it, and this is the thing, you need to compare it to actual standards out there, maybe it doesn't have kind of like the depth or the quality that those users need to actually start using that. Well, and that's it from my side. And now I also want to hear your thoughts and get into kind of like applying that. First of all, I want to hear your comments and your thoughts. And then I would like to quickly talk about like some of these examples and take a look at the tokenization, adept tokenization space to see what your guys' approach would be to design an adoption, user adoption strategy. So this shows the value capture of it, right? And the question is like, at what level are you taking a look at the market? Like, are you taking a look at the worldwide market? Or are you taking a look at local markets? Because I think what protocols do in the first place is actually slash the kind of like value creation for the companies, because it is a zero margin protocol, right? So it's what newcomers to, for example, the fund market did when they slashed the, like when they offered direct funds for not 5% but a 2% fee. So first of all, they're able to capture a whole lot of the market, and it's worthwhile because, and this makes it worthwhile, even though they just take 2%. I guess when it's zero, then first of all, there is a lot of value capture that's actually gone. So from the local level, I think it can happen that if you are focused on blockchain and you just get all these new users, then it will grow. But I think on international level, it's going to get harder to capture it. We're actually going to see also more network effects coming into play on both sides, even on the application side. Just to give you an example, like there are several banks at the moment, right? The reason for it is that like it's still the thing that if you want a loan, you go to your local bank, but there is no really a reason for it. So if you have loan protocols, then you suddenly, like network effects can take full effect. So wiping out most of the banks out there, and you have a similar landscape like you have that with, for example, online marketplaces, e-commerce.
One question regarding standards dedicated to identity. What's your take on the evolvement of blockchain identity? Because there, standardization is super important, and you are dealing with ID as well. So do you see that as a special case, or is it fits pretty much to, or you can compare it with all other protocols and dApps as well? Because, I mean, ID is, let's say, you have probably more dependencies compared to other protocols and application cases.
I think in general, the more online something is, like cloud storage, for example, the easier it is to replicate a governance model for it. And identity has a lot of offline touch points, and that makes it really hard to evolve quickly. Also, if you think about it, there are so many standards out there already, and one standard is the passport, right? Like, this is what it's pretty much up against. It can, for example, adopt the standard and replicate it, but basically there is quite a lot of adoption towards different system needed for it to become actually usable. Like, we are, for example, just dealing with a regulatory side of onboarding, so KYC, AML onboarding, and that alone is just so much to understand and to implement, because for some countries, you know, like the driver license doesn't work because it's not an official document. For some other countries it is, and for some countries they allow things only to be 3 months old, and for other countries that's fine if it's like 2 years old or whatever. And this is something that is happening at the moment, and I actually think that the identity space is one of the most interesting spaces out there. But then again, interestingly enough, I think the identity space actually allows for 2 or more protocols to evolve. And you kind of see that pretty much like your Facebook login and your Google login. Those are 2 kinds of identities already that kind of find their niche. And you still have your official identity. Does that answer your question? All right. Okay, so let's take a look at those 3 examples. Let's just start with sovereign because we've been talking about identity right now. Where do you see sovereign? Like, what space are they going to? What space are they tackling? Is there already something in the market?
Yes.
Quite a bit, actually. If you think about, you have your ID card, you have your Google login, but I agree. I would also think it's you're going for the individual user for onboarding, and it's probably a little bit more on the right side. So the approach would be, and we can think about that later, would be to find the niche and kind of grow from there. Do you guys know Dharma?
So yeah, Dharma is a lending platform, and from my opinion, if I understand it right, you could lend crypto to other people. From my opinion, it would be more important to have the supply side. So you need elephants to provide liquidity for the platform, that the users are able to lend tokens finally. Yeah. And I think it's also, there are standards, so there are other ways to lend money in the world. So yeah.
So interestingly enough, I don't know, was it Dharma or was it Salt? But one of those 2 protocols went into margin lending. Do you guys know which one? Well, anyway, I mean, so naturally, I would totally agree with you. Like, you're trying to replace banks, right? So this is the ultimate goal. And so you probably are going to be on the far right corner. But what they are trying to do is they are going to move down to actually address a market that's much more attainable. So people that are already in crypto that have the problem that they don't get credit for, you know, the future options, so they can use a lending protocol to get this, to get the credit. Actually, it's a smart move because then you get adoption in the first place, and you don't have to wait until like one of those big elephants is actually going to adapt you. There is actually one player who, but let's get to that later. So Ocean, Some of you may have already heard about it. Where would you place Ocean?
Okay, so I'm inclined to place it on the top left. My reasoning is that Ocean as a protocol is designed to be used by marketplaces, and the marketplaces are larger players. And of course, there are a lot of standards for sharing, for example, data sets and AI, and you can just download them from wherever. But it's also about the low switching cost for me. So I'm a bit torn, but I would still say it's something perhaps a bit new, and therefore maybe there isn't really an established standard for what the project is addressing. That'd be my train of thought.
I think all of these examples kind of show how, if you think about it, you might be able in the token design to kind of tilt it a little bit into kind of like a different animal, depending on how you design the incentives. And that is something that you might want to consider if you design a token or an economy. But what you want to consider when you kind of go for the adoption strategy. So to wrap it up, I would like to talk about the debt tokenization space. And I want to kind of prototype a go-to-market strategy with you guys. So I came up with this very basic model of how that works in general. So, I mean, what you can see on the ecosystem side, you have quite a lot of players there. You have the borrowers, the lenders, someone to kind of like put the money on the risk premium, and someone to collect that, to collect the payments. And you have some needs on the application side. If you take a look at the left bottom corner, you see that, for example, the borrowers, they need a curated market, and they need to identify themselves. You have the curation market for lenders as well, and you need to have, you want to trade that, so you want to have an exchange or some infrastructure, and you want to have some kind of wallet to hold those assets, right? For the people evaluating the risk, you need data, and for the collectors, you need integration because there are already collectors in the real world. So the contenders are those four. I actually just knew 2.5. So Salt, Dharma, and Ethland I've heard about. And the existing standards are there, but they are only pretty much used in the US, where you have pretty vibrant market for auctioning off crowd-funded loans. So that's happening. But this is, for example, not existing in Europe too much. So this is the situation. So the question is, how are we going to design the go-to-market strategy for the debt token? Do you guys have an idea how would you tackle the market? So you would rather cater to individual borrowers to assure adoption. Is that something where there is an existing offer out there already, an existing standard? There is. Mm-hmm. Which one? Well, what do you say?
Probably not in terms of standards, as you mentioned. There aren't that many standards worldwide, but in terms of there is an existing offer to most of people who are looking for lending, but at the same time certain conditions, and therefore I would address the borrowers with better conditions, basically, and faster process and lower efforts, such kind of benefits.
I mean, the base question is if you have, and I mean, there are obviously people borrowing money in the world. The question is, where do you get like the ×5 advantage towards others, that it becomes plain obvious that you want to use that? And there are some approaches here. For example, you could design a protocol that actually does cater to borrowers, and maybe at a region where there is no capital available in the first place, right? Like in Germany, it's, well, we might complain about the banks, but actually it is working. If you have income and you want to borrow money, you probably get the money. But this is different, let's say, if you want to start a business, let's say in Indonesia, in some parts. And so maybe catering there and using the advantages there could mean that it works, where you have a very different approach. You've heard about the micro-lending approach, where you don't go in and you need a whole lot of data, because what you pretty much take staking from like 5 people from the same town, vouching for each other, and then you get the loan. And actually, based on the history of lending from those folks, you get a really small default rate. So it's actually working, and you could just use this model and automate that a lot more. There could be one approach, but there could be others. For example, you cater to the big banks, and you build a consortium and give them a share of your protocol, right? That could also work. So there are different approaches towards how you build the protocol in the first place, based on who you want to gain as a customer and how you think that you get traction in the market. That's it from my side. Thanks. Are there any questions?
What's your point of view on the situation today when protocols are built and dApps are built? I feel like we are still in a phase where people are exploring what's technically feasible, and then you just get something interesting, bonding curve concept that makes XYZ feasible in the first place, and then you start building it, right? So it's not that I feel that it's not that much, or not that much teams are coming from an angle where they are exploring a market and working through what's the exact niche we could take, or what's a market uncatered today we could address. What do you think about it?
Well, I mean, we did build a basic infrastructure to also facilitate ICOs, right? So the onboarding and the payment structure of it can be like put together to facilitate that. And even though we just worked with folks that really wanted to get a protocol up and running, we did of course see that there are multiple teams working on the same thing, and there are just so many standards that you can get, right? And of course, the focus on the protocol and not on the application layer was also driven by the fact that you could do an ICO really easily, let's say, well, a year ago, maybe a little bit longer ago. And so all of these standards are now there, but they don't have any traction. And right now, everything that's coming up is actually built in a different way. And that's quite interesting. Not saying that all the ones that have come up in the last 2 or 3 years since then kind of just focus on doing an ICO, but most of them did. And now we see teams that plan their ICO for 2021. So that's pretty cool. Or you see protocols that don't even plan for that and just plan for the adoption in like manufacturing infrastructure, or, you know, like you barely hear about them because they just like work with B2B corporates to make something work. And by default, you hear more about the protocols that want to cater to actually individual customers in the end.
you.